What's up everyone, Super Nerd Daniel here once again. Back in December, I posted my latest What If video, constructing Pokemon teams for some of the characters from Undertale. There were actually quite a few comments that suggested other fandoms for me to try and tackle with this series, and while I appreciate the suggestions, and there are a couple that I want to try and do at some point, I'd be remiss if I didn't take this chance to do an episode for Avatar: The Last Airbender. Avatar was honestly one of my favorite shows of the mid-2000s. It had deep, complex, and well-written characters, beautiful animation, a great balance of action, humor, and drama, and a gorgeous soundtrack. I loved everything about this show. Well, except maybe the Great Divide, but let's be honest here, nobody likes the Great Divide. And since the main crux of the Avatar universe is the ability that some people, called benders, have to control different elements at will, it's rife for opportunities to introduce Pokemon into the mix, considering their own bevy of elemental powers. So today, I'm gonna tell you what I think some of the characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender would be like as Pokemon trainers. Now, as folks who've watched the What If series up to this point know, for the sake of not making things atrociously long, I usually only stick to about 5 characters from whatever fandom I talk about, which is perfect for this episode, because there just so happens to be 5 characters in the main cast of heroes, mainly referred to as Team Avatar. And what better character to start with than the guy who not only came up with that name, but also kind of viewed himself as the leader of the group for a while, Sokka. Sokka is actually one of many people in the world born without the ability to bend, but he's never let that stop him from joining the fight against the Fire Nation. Even if at first his battle skills and strategies left maybe a bit to be desired, he eventually became a master swordsman and an excellent strategist. At the same time though, he always found time to try and crack a joke, even if he didn't seem to inherit his father's comedic timing.
Perfume? Maybe we could dump some on Appa, because he stinks so much. Am I right?
You have your father's wit.
Unlike the other characters in this video, Sokka won't necessarily have Pokemon that are known for a specific elemental power because, as I said, he himself isn't a bender, relying mainly instead on his melee and weapon-based combat skills. That being said, his first Pokemon is going to be a fighting type, specifically a Tyrogue. Now don't worry, I'm not going to pull up a Pyrus from the Undertale video and give him all basic mods just because he's not a bender. It's just that Sokka always felt like he had to prove himself and his skills, given that he was the son of a great warrior, and he was the only non-bender in a group full of revered benders, and I feel like Tyrogue best represents that, given that it's always training and striving to improve. And speaking of Pokemon who always fight to prove themselves, let's also give Sokka a Braviary, a Pokemon who will never retreat from a battle, even when it's injured, and is revered by its flock for its battle scars. Next up, Klefki, a Pokemon with the ability Prankster to let it use status moves with increased priority, making it an excellent lead for competitive teams to start putting a team strategy into motion. You might even say that this Pokemon would give Sokka the key to victory? Oh, screw you, that was funny. And last, but definitely not least, an Aegislash, because, well, I mean, come on, I had to give him a Pokemon to represent his space sword. It's a sword made out of a friggin' meteorite, man. How many characters can you say have actually effectively forged a weapon out of something from space? And now we go from Sokka to his sister, the last known waterbender of the Southern Water Tribe, Katara. After the death of her mother at the hands of the Fire Nation and the departure of her father to join the war, Katara basically kept her family from falling into pieces by taking on something of a motherly role, and that maternal personality carried over to her travels with Team Avatar, often acting as the voice of reason and patience within the group. She was also a tremendously talented waterbending master, despite initially having to teach herself how to bend since there were no other benders in her tribe, and her fierce determination, her maturity, and her compassion towards others all really held Team Avatar together, even during their lowest moments. And bearing that compassionate personality in mind, I think it's fair to start her Pokemon team off with Alomomola, a water type that has special healing properties and gently cares for injured Pokemon, embodying both Katara's compassionate personality and her ability to use water bending for healing. Next up, I'm gonna give her a Kangaskhan to represent Katara's maternal personality, and her willingness to fiercely protect those close to her. And speaking of which, let's throw in a Gyarados too, because while Katara is usually fairly level-headed and kind, she also has a short temper and a tendency to hold long grudges, particularly against people who hurt those she cares about. And to round out Katara's team, I'm gonna give her Tapu Fini, and I know it might seem unfair to give her a legendary Pokemon, but in all fairness, Katara would eventually become recognized around the world as one of the greatest waterbending masters, not to mention one of the best best healers, so I think it's perfectly fair that her immense skill be recognized with a Pokemon of great power and reverence. Plus, I'm hoping that Tapu Fini's ability to purify any body of water will help cure the toxicity that's overcome YouTube as a platform these days. Next up, we have perhaps the most unique member of Team Avatar, both in bending style and in personality, Toph Beifong. Despite being overprotected by her doting parents and being part of one of the richest families in the Earth Kingdom, Toph quickly established herself as being fiercely independent, stubborn, and confrontational, but above all else, an incredibly capable Earthbender, being able to defeat many opponents despite the fact that she was born blind. She sees through the use of seismic sense, an ability that allows her to use the vibrations of the Earth to sense others' movements. And this deep connection with the Earth beneath her feet allowed her to become so skilled at earthbending that she was able to invent metal bending simply by bending the earth impurities present in metal objects, adding quite a bit of credibility to her claim of being the greatest earthbender in the world. In all fairness though, the first Pokemon on Toph's team isn't a rock or ground type at all, but rather a Machamp, in reference to her time as the Blind Bandit, a persona she created while secretly participating in earthbending tournaments, which were basically just the Avatar universe's portrayal of professional wrestling. Fun fact, the character she defeated to retain her title at Earth Rumble 6, the Boulder, is a parody in name and mannerisms of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and was actually voiced by Mick Foley, who's not only another pro wrestler, but was also a longtime rival and even a tag team championship partner of The Rock's. The more you know.
The Boulder feels conflicted about fighting a young blind girl.
Sounds to me like you're scared, Boulder.
The Boulder's over his conflicted feelings, and now he's ready to bury you in a rock-a-lanche.
Whenever you're ready, the Pebble.
Moving right along, I think Toph would also have a Lycanroc, Midnight form specifically, a Pokemon whose Pokedex entry is depicted as being rebellious and typically unwilling to listen to orders that it doesn't really like, right in line with the independent and somewhat aloof nature that often put her at odds with the motherly and mature, but sometimes kind of self-righteous Katara. After that, we're going to round out her team with two ground and steel types. First off, Excadrill, a perfect reference for how Toph first learned to see using earthbending from giant blind moles, and Steelix, a Pokemon who lives miles underground and is able to perfectly see down there despite the darkness. And I know it's not a perfect metaphor for Toph's blindness, but let's be honest here. The only Pokemon who's truly blind and uses anything close to Toph's seismic sense to make up for its lack of sight would be Zubat, and I think the person who single-handedly invented metal bending deserves a little bit better than a Zubat, don't you? And now we've come to my personal favorite character in the entire Avatar universe, the banished prince of the Fire Nation, Zuko. Zuko was actually the primary antagonist of Avatar: The Last Airbender throughout Book 1 and a good chunk of Book 2, having been burned and banished by his own father, Fire Lord Ozai, and being stripped of his birthright, only being allowed to return home if he could capture the Avatar. It's this overwhelming need to reclaim his lost honor, and his father's love, that initially drives Zuko in many of his attempts to capture Aang, but over time, his experiences and his travels alongside his uncle Iroh began to change Zuko as a person, and he not only abandoned his pursuit of Aang, but became his ally and, eventually, one of his closest friends. In time, Zuko would reclaim his honor and his birthright, but he did it his own way, the right way, and used his position as Fire Lord to undo the damage that his forefathers had caused to the world. You better believe we're starting off red hot with a fire type right away for Zuko's team, namely Infernape, whose Pokedex entry states that it uses unique fighting moves with fire on its hands and feet, and that it'll take on any opponent. I think that ties in quite nicely with how Zuko had something of an inferiority complex growing up, due to his father always favoring his sister Azula over him, given Azula's superior grasp of firebending, and his many interactions with his father causing Zuko to have a driving need to prove himself, to prove that he was good enough. Next up, Absol, a Pokemon I've talked to death about on this channel, but one that I think would fit really nicely for Zuko. Due to its constant presence where disasters and mishaps are about to strike, people think of it as a doombringer or a sign of misfortune. I feel like this would fit pretty well with Zuko, given his belief that the world was out to get him, stemming yet again from something said by his father.
You're like my sister. Everything always came easy to her. She's a firebending prodigy, and everyone adores her. My father says she was born lucky. He says I was lucky to be born.
Next up, Doublade, as a reference to Zuko's formidable skill with dual broadswords. It's not something that's shown that often throughout the series, as Zuko prefers to rely on his firebending in combat, but his dual Dao swordsmanship was always really cool to see whenever it did come out in the course of a fight. Of course, since that Doublade isn't fully evolved, it is going to have to be holding an Eviolite just to give it a bit more bulk. And to round out the Pokemon team of the Banished Prince, it's Houndoom, whose burns are said to hurt forever, and I don't think I need to prattle on too long about why being permanently scarred is relevant to Zuko.
Normal teenagers worry about bad skin. I don't have that luxury. My father decided to teach me a permanent lesson on my face.
Sheesh, kinda makes things like acne outbreaks seem trivial, doesn't it? And last but absolutely not least, the namesake of Team Avatar, the last living air nomad, the Avatar himself, Aang. Despite being destined to bring balance to the elements of water, earth, fire, and air in order to save the world, Aang initially didn't take his role as the Avatar too seriously, often expressing a carefree and goofy attitude, but his demeanor often belied a rather tragic past. He was told he was the Avatar at a relatively young age, much younger than Avatar's past, and when he found out that he was going to be separated from his longtime friend and mentor, Monkey Yatso, Aang ran away, got caught in a storm, and became frozen in a block of ice for 100 years, inevitably leaving his people, and the world at large, to be overrun by the Imperial March of the Fire Nation. But despite the immense guilt he felt for these events and the burdens he was expected to bear as the Avatar, he never lost sight of who he was, and was always that same kind, peace-loving, goofy kid at heart. Let's start off Aang's Pokemon team with a Sigilyph, a psychic and flying type whose Pokedex entries all talk about how they protect their ancient cities and will use their powers to ward off invaders. I think this goes pretty nicely with Aang's steadfast protection of his people's traditions and landmarks, and his tendency to react harshly to those who he perceives as disrespecting air nomad culture, like the people who take up refuge in the Northern Air Temple, modifying it with technology to make it more hospitable to them.
We have to make room for the bathhouse.
Do you know what you did? You just destroyed something sacred for a stupid bathhouse.
Next, Aang will have a Whimsicott, a Pokemon that not only has the ability Prankster to represent Aang's goofy, fun-loving nature, but according to the Pokedex, Whimsicott doesn't live in a fixed location and instead travels around on the wind, much like the air nomads themselves would do. And speaking of the air nomad lifestyle, their pacifist teachings would go well with Aang's next Pokemon, Togekiss, a Pokemon who avoids unnecessary conflict, right in line with how Aang would always seek peaceful, non-violent solutions and would sometimes honestly avoid facing certain problems and issues head-on. And lastly, Aang would have a Salamence, a Pokemon that destroys everything around it and loses all sense of self when it's angry, because despite Aang mostly being a positive and carefree kid, he would often succumb to his anger whenever someone he cared about was threatened, and would sometimes not be above hurting others to protect those that he loved, despite his generally pacifistic beliefs. And just for fun, let's make it Mega Salamence. Just cuz. Of course, that would be the team for regular Airbender Aang. If we're talking about Avatar State Aang, where he has access to all the knowledge and power of all his past lives, then I think it's fair to just give him a bunch of legendaries, because, hey, if Aang himself is gonna be absurdly OP, his Pokemon team may as well be stupidly powerful too, right? So, what Pokemon do you think characters from Avatar The Last Airbender would have on their teams? Let me know in the comments below. Give this video a like if you liked it, and subscribe for more Elemental What If videos in the future. See you next time, Pokemon trainers. Super Nerd Daniel, out.